Month of December, we took a break, did some different Christmas stuff, and just for the fun of it. And so we never really finished up some of that, but I'm just going to leave it where it lay. If you still believe in Santa Claus after this year, then good on you. So, but we one question was whether or not we think it's a good idea to let your kids believe in Santa Claus or something like that. And so we don't, and that's just a choice that we've made, though. You're welcome to do whatever you want, but you have to explain to your kids why you lied to them their whole life, once they do find out that he's not true. And so that would be my answer to that in short. So don't lie to your kids would be the real answer to that. And but you also don't have to act like Santa Claus is, Santa Claus is spelled different. It spells Satan, and so that's also not the way we view it either. So there you have it. And there's more I could have said on all of that, but I did want to jump back into where we were a little while ago. We were talking about Jesus, and we're in the midst of this current issues thing series, and I want to dive into some things that are maybe a little bit more even pertinent to that particular vein of thought. Where we started with all of this was kind of the thought that there's a lot of different religions out there. What makes Christianity the one that is superior, and why is it that you can't just have a bunch of them? And so we talked about the coexist reality, or reality that some people try to push, the coexist issue, and we were kind of looking at different facets of that. And then when we finished up some of that, I felt that it was the appropriate time to just look at the idea that Jesus is a real person, and that being the foundation of the entire Christian way of thinking. The entire biblical narrative, the entire Christian religion, so to speak, is founded on the presence of Jesus Christ as a historical figure in history, and in all of the tales of the Bible, not just being fables that Christians tell, but legitimate stories. And that is why Christianity rises above all of those other religions that we have that we looked at. And so what I tried to do is set the stage for how do we know then that Jesus actually was a real person? Because there are people that have even brought that to the table and said, well, how do you know he was a person at all in history? Because, history is written by people, and people could have lied. Or how do we know he was the way that he said he was? And all of the things that would kind of stem from those particular questions or those particular attacks. And I wanted you to have good information to know when somebody comes to you and questions the existence of Jesus, so-called. Really, what they're ultimately doing is questioning the authenticity of the biblical narrative itself, because you really can't separate the one from the other. And though some of what I talked about, and I know it's been a month and a half, and unless you really needed what I said that night, most of you probably forgot everything I said, because I probably forgot everything I said that night. So it's just the reality of the way that information we live on in a world where information just comes at us all the time. So you just it kind of goes in one ear out the other, unless it was something that you really needed in the moment. You probably already forgot a lion's share of it, unless in a moment like this I bring it up and you're like, oh yeah, I do kind of remember some of that stuff. So I get all of that, and so that's why I'm just kind of catching us all back up to speed, because I don't want to get bogged back down here. I just want to say a few things tonight, see if there's any questions about it. And then what I want you to be thinking as I'm talking, I know that I'm kind of splitting your thinking up, though. I want to hear from you before we close tonight, if there are any issues current that you would like to hear me put a little bit of a presentation together, because that's what I tried to do, is try to put somewhat of a presentation of thought together, and then see what dialogue that might spark amongst us. If there's any issues you're like, I want to hear you talk about this, I would love to have a discussion and Bible study about this, or whatever would fit underneath this. this heading. And so all of that being said, we talked over the course of our lesson before about the importance of the actual Jesus in history, and that's what I just alluded to just a moment ago, so I'm not going to say more there. But then we talked about the quest for the historical Jesus, and this is probably where I went probably a little bit too deep onto some things that I felt like when I got done, I was like, probably wasn't the best. It was good information, I think, but probably got a little bit in the weeds. But we were talking about there have been different approaches to figuring out who Jesus actually was throughout history during the different phases of textual criticism and knowing, okay, was Jesus who the Bible says he is? Was he just a man? There was kind of different phases. There's different aspects of that. And so we talked about the quest throughout history, basically from about 1700 on, with the rise of modern scholarship. Okay, who was Jesus actually? And so we looked at some of those things. But tonight I want to talk to you for just a few minutes about the arguments against the historical Jesus. Okay, how there are people that will say, okay, Jesus didn't exist, and these are some of the reasons why. These are some of the things that they level against him. And so the first one that we're just going to put a couple of them up at a time, but the first one is that the disciples made him up. So the disciples then would actually not even be disciples of Jesus themselves. They would just have been a group of religious people that made up the figure Jesus, and that there was no person in history that was named Jesus himself. So the disciples made him up, or later on a religious institution desiring a figurehead created this myth about Jesus, and in all of the stories then that we have about the miracles and all of the things that happened in Jerusalem, all of those things are not true. They were all made up by the church in the Middle Ages or late several hundred years after the fact, and so that would be what some people would say. Now, the problem that you would encounter with that one, and I've told you this before. Alternative theories to explain alternative theories are not an explanation of the evidence, right? So just because somebody says, well, I just think the church made Jesus up. Like, that's a claim, right? So if somebody ever makes a claim like that, you have to discipline yourself to make them explain how they arrived at that conclusion. What evidence do you have to then, how do you explain what they would call the so-called evidence then that there is of the expressions of Jesus as a historical figure? Now, the thing that I would challenge you to think about when you're looking at, okay, well, did the disciples just make Jesus up, is questioning whether or not the records or the writings of the New Testament are authentic. Now, the fact is, the writings of the New Testament can be traced back to the mid-1st century or later. So if you can, or just a little bit later than that, I mean, not a little, much later wouldn't matter, but so if you're saying, okay, well, the early church made Jesus up, well, then how do you explain the fact that there were writings, the New Testament itself, that date back almost to 100 AD, if he didn't get made up until 400 or 500 AD? And so you already have right there. It's just like, well, okay, well, I guess that can't possibly be true because the evidence goes back further than the claim itself, and so that claim does not explain the fact that there are records that say that. Well, records itself, the Bible, the manuscript evidence of the Bible itself goes back further than the claim itself. So there had to have been somebody within the first 100 years of the supposed execution of Jesus had to make him up, not in 400 or 500 AD, as some people would say. So it wasn't the early church. That you could say, well, then maybe it was the disciples. Well, the problem with that claim is that the claims made in the New Testament are claims that eyewitnesses would have been there to debunk. So if Peter got up and said, well, yeah, this is like near the end of Peter's life, like, yeah, I remember at Pentecost, and people are like, no, because I was there at that year in Pentecost, and you didn't preach that message. There is no Jesus. What are you talking about, man? But the fact that much of our evidence about Jesus goes all the way back to the time period in which eyewitnesses or the people who would have known eyewitnesses could have been there, and yet the myth, so-called, took or was able to establish such a stable footing in that environment, really disproves the fact that it could have just been totally made up, as if meaning that there was no Jesus. So you'd have to push back and say, well, there is evidence that goes all the way back to the period of time in which eyewitnesses could have pushed back against this, and yet this became a firmly entrenched way of thinking starting in the area that the myth actually, you're claiming the myth actually started in. And so why would the two not have, if somebody is putting forth a major lie, you might say, well, people put forth major lies all the time right now. That's true. I mean, you just have to look at social media to find out that people can tell lies and pass them off as truth, and they do it all day long. And there's bots that do it. There's all kinds of stuff like that. They didn't have social media in that day. It honestly is easier to pass off a lie as a mainstream way of thinking today than it has ever been. I mean, because you can make a flashy video on TikTok and you can say some things and make some claims. I was watching or listening to a podcast just a little bit ago, just a couple hours ago, and both people in the podcast I relatively agreed with in many respects, but one person kind of kept harping on these points, and it was just, you could tell that they were just totally glossing over a large body of thinking to get to where they were, and I could hear the rhetoric of other videos that I've watched on YouTube or wherever, and when somebody latches onto these ways of thinking that are just put forth as true, and it's really easy right now for people to just put forth videos that sound really polished and really smart, and they as if they have evidence, but they're really not pointing to any real evidence. They're just making truth claims, so to speak. But man, it just spreads like wildfire. In Jesus' day, mythologically speaking, if that's what if they were saying that he was made up, in that day, it would not have been nearly as easy to entrench in the public psyche the story of someone who never existed, right in Jerusalem, where all of the stories were supposed to have taken place, and yet none of them did. So the idea that he was made up really is an idea that just has a great number of obstacles to overcome. And so then you could say, well, then the disciples just embellished the records. It really wasn't to the extent that it was. So Jesus existed, yes, but they must have lied about him. He didn't perform miracles. There's no doubt about that. He was not really as maybe as good as he was, or whatever the case may be. He didn't rise from the dead. And so then when people, if that was the claim, and that is the claim that many people will make, well, Jesus was just embellished. The church made up the stories later on. The disciples made up the stories about him. Well, there's a problem with that. And the problem is what we talked about when we talked about the resurrection, right? Because the resurrection is one of the miracles, obviously the most important miracle that Jesus performed while he was on this earth. And there is, not to bring up all of that evidence again, but there is no explanation for the resurrection that holds as much water as the resurrection. And so all of the theories that have been, well, he swooned on the cross and then he woke up in the tomb later and he got out of the tomb. And we've talked about all those things. It would be really hard for a nearly dead guy to roll back the stone and all of the different things and then be walking around for the next 40, 50 days and be seen of many, many, many people and as if he hadn't had his body just lacerated by a cat of nine tails and all of the things that happened. So all of those bits of evidence are ones that have to be brought into the consideration of, okay, well, if they're saying we made it up, they're probably pointing to things like the resurrection, but how do you explain away the resurrection? Well, we've tried, and no one has come up with a satisfactory explanation for the resurrection itself and all the things that flow out of the resurrection, except that it had to have happened. And then the idea that the stories are made up are really hard to pass off, because if the disciples were lying, think about who we're talking about. We're talking about fishermen, unless they lied about their profession. Fishermen, tax collector, maybe. Obviously, probably pretty much lied for a living, or at least mistreated people for a living. Tax collectors, the most educated of the early, not disciples, but apostles, was Paul. So you might be able to say, well, Paul. But you think about the disciples themselves, who are most of the time are the ones that wrote Matthew, Mark wasn't an early disciple, but wrote Peter's account, John, and Luke being later on a historian. But you think about the people that wrote much of this. These were not the people that were the intellectual elites. You say, how do you know that? Well, that's what the intellectual elites of the day said about them. Like, hey, these are ignorant and unlearned men. So what people are trying to say is that ignorant and unlearned, dumb, dirty fishermen were smart enough and were coordinated enough to lie to everyone and pass the lie off enough that thousands and thousands and thousands of people began to believe it, up to obviously millions and then millions throughout history since then. And they never cracked. There was no flaws in the lies that they put together. That would have to be part of the equation if they were to have embellished the stories. And so some people will say, well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but so I'll come back to that thought here in just a second, because so they embellished the stories would be one aspect of it, or he wasn't really who he said he was, would be a little bit connected to both of those. But Jesus, they might say, okay, well, we will stipulate that Jesus existed, but he really wasn't who he said he was, right? And that's what Nick brought this up a while back. There's the classic C.S. Lewis popularized this. It's called the trilemma, right? So the trilemma is very simply stated as this, right? So Jesus claimed to be God while he was on this earth. And that's a claim that we could take a lot of time, and we could look at it. I remember having a friend in high school, and a friend, I guess you might call him, a guy that I sat near a few times in different classes throughout my career in high school. His name was Mike, and I remember Mike would frequently argue with me about the Bible, and he'd say every once in a while, he'd be like, well, Jesus never even claimed to be God. How many of you have ever had somebody say that to you? Anybody? Right. Now, what that person is typically trying to point out is that there's no explicit statement, like verbatim claim in the Bible where Jesus stands up in front of the crowd and says, I am God. But that's really what he is saying. Now, Jesus said it over and over and over and over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, the more I read through the Gospels, the more I am astounded that anybody didn't get what he was saying, because he was pretty clear. And so it's just, he said so many different things. Now, so Jesus claimed to be God. Now, the trilemma goes like this. So Jesus is either the Lord, he's a liar, or he's a lunatic. So he's the Lord because if he said he was God and he is God, well then he's the Lord, right? But if he said he was God and he wasn't, and he knew he wasn't, then he's a liar. But if you say something you know is not true, you're a liar. And liars should not be followed, right? We don't follow liars if they're intentionally trying to pull something like that. Now everybody probably lies more often than they realize, but you know what I mean by that. So if he's a liar about who he is at the core, don't follow him. He's not worth following. Now, if he says he's God and he's not, and he thinks he is, he's crazy. And I'm not sure which one I'd rather follow, a crazy person or a liar. Probably neither, right? And so so when you look at these three options, you can then begin to look at each one of them, carefully look at, okay, was Jesus a liar? And you can begin to take apart each one of those aspects. We're not going to do that tonight. You can look at, was he a liar? Was he crazy? Well, no, he wasn't crazy, because you can look at plenty of the things that he said and that he did, that he was able to accomplish, to break down all of the arguments against both of those different things. The only available option is that he was who he said he was. He was God himself. And so the claim that Jesus was just a good teacher and not God in the flesh really falls apart, because good teachers aren't crazy. Good teachers aren't liars. They have to be who they say they are, the things they have to say. So that's a loose look at the idea. Now, the only alternative to that is that Jesus wasn't real at all. And that's why that attack comes. That's why the attack at the historical Jesus gets brought up. Okay, then Jesus couldn't have been a real person. Or then that's why the stories, the church made the stories up about him and all of these different things. So those would be some things that we would say, okay, these are some arguments against the historical Jesus. So how then can we make a case for the biblical Jesus? How do we know then that Jesus actually existed? There's just a few things I want you to think about before we even dive into it. Now, the first one is history is actually knowable. Some people that would come at this argument would say, well, we don't really know what happened because everything that's history is written by biased people, because I even heard the claim within the last couple of days, the victors write the history. And so, Christians, the Catholic Church was the predominant religious entity for obviously the Middle Ages, wrong as it was. And yet the Catholic Church, wrote much of the history. And so obviously they were biased. And so there's a lot of things that people say, well, history's not knowable. It is actually, right? Just because there's a length of time between, we know that history is knowable kind of implicitly. You know what you got for Christmas. It is history now, right? Now, some of it's really history because it was food and you ate it. And those are the best gifts, right? Maybe not best, but they're some of the best. We know that there are things that happen. We referenced already the Y2K, right? In 1999, here we go. And my parents had all kinds of stuff stockpiled just in case. They didn't really think it was going to happen, but man, we had more ketchup than we ever needed in the world. And so we had beans, we had grape juice. I mean, it was whatever we had, man alive, we had too much of it. And so instant mashed potatoes, and some places make instant mashed potatoes and you can stomach them, but these were like, when my mom would make them, it was like glue, and it wouldn't come off your spoon. And mashed potatoes are some of my favorite food. And so there was a terrible season in my life, and I know it happened, but it was history. I mean, that's like ancient history now. Some of you weren't even alive, right? But we know it happened. So history is knowable. We implicitly know that you can know what happened, even though it happened a while ago. The people that argue against the knowability of history often bring forth arguments to, people that wrote the history are biased. Or the problem with all of that is, and I've got a few points, I don't want to dig too deeply into any one of them. The problem with all of that is we all know the difference between good history and bad history. We've all probably had to read a biography for school at some point that was atrocious. It was bad. Or you've maybe read somebody's take on the like the 1619 Project or something like that, and we've all heard about bad history, bad interpretations of historical events. But even in the midst of all of that, people that try to reinterpret history and all of that, there is still the idea that there were actual events that happened. And through a careful examination of the records that are available, we can have a halfway decent idea of what actually happened. Whether it was two weeks ago, 20 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. And the funny thing is, it's almost like there's just this little segment of history that's questionable. You know that we know some things about Egyptian culture, and obviously we've got the pyramids still, but you know that we are currently closer on the timeline, like in this room, are closer on the timeline to Julius Caesar than Julius Caesar was to the construction of the pyramids. And we think, man, Julius Caesar lived a long time ago, died a long time ago. But we are closer on the timeline to him than he was to the Egyptians. those Egyptians that built the pyramids. And so, but we don't look back at the Egyptian history and be like, well, it's sus, right? I mean, like, I don't know about that. No, we know what we know about it. We know what we can know about it. And so it's a very self-defeating argument. And many times it is an argument that is based on the desire to deny something specifically. And so it's broad brush as, we can't really know because of all of those things. So history is knowable. The supernatural is possible. Some people will deny biblical history in the events of Jesus' life because there are supernatural events within the narrative itself. It's that, it can't possibly be true because miracles aren't possible. Well, you know what the definition of a miracle is? It is the suspension of the natural order by God. And so, by its very definition, it is already breaking the rule. But God can do that, right? Because if God is true, and God made the natural order, he can also break it, so to speak, because he is outside of the natural order. And so to deny the plausibility of a story because there are supernatural events in it, it's not really that good of an argument because you're stepping into a narrative that has as its basis, and that's why we talked about the worldview concept before we even delved into some of these current issues. We're entering into a worldview that allows for, because of a belief in an existence of a supernatural God. And so it's basically self-defeating. It's like assuming the existence of the thing and then denying the existence of the thing within that realm. And so it's just one of those things like, that just really doesn't make sense when you really dig into it. So the supernatural is possible, and there's more that could be said about all of this. But then the Bible is authentic history. So this is why I said that really the arguments against Jesus are really just arguments against the authenticity of the Bible. So how do we know that the Bible is authentic? What do we know that makes it so when we look into the Bible itself, we can say, that's probably historically accurate? I was listening to something yesterday, listening to the Genesis series that Jordan Peterson put out, and working my way through it for a long time, but I was listening to it yesterday, and one thing he talked about on his lecture on Abraham. One of the things that amazed Jordan Peterson, who is not anywhere close to where we, most of us that sit or stand in this room, are when it comes to the Bible. He's not anywhere close to our viewpoint on the Bible, but he's got some perception on it that I think is interesting, so I listened to some of his content. But one of the things he said that's interesting about Abraham, because in all of the other myths about ancient religious figures, there is very much a divine, mythical, supernatural element to some of the main characters in the narrative itself. But that is definitely not true when it comes to most of the people. Abraham was being the specific one that he talked about. Abraham, when you read the story of Abraham, yes, he has conversations with God, but Abraham is very much a real person. When you read about him, it comes across like, that guy is a lot like us. I mean, his lifestyle obviously was different, but he messed up like we did. It seems like you could just be reading an article about some guy that did this thing, because the details of it are detailed enough, but not detailed in such a way that they seem like they're just fables. And that's one of the unique things about the Bible. And one thing about the authenticity, there's a few things I want you to see about indications for authenticity. So one being that there is historical congruence within the Bible itself. The presentations of the stories of the Bible, if somebody's saying these are made up stories, then they have to explain why is it that the stories themselves perfectly fit within the time period that they are claiming to be written in. Because if somebody wrote them after the fact, it's really hard to get them perfect. You know what an anachronism is, right? It's when you take an an element of today and you read it back into back into history. And it's really hard not to do that. For instance, all of us in this room believe that slavery is wrong. You don't have to go any further than that. It's just like, well, like there's no argument there. Like, it's just like, of course it's wrong. But when we read about all the history of the world, but obviously our history here in this country, you read about our history and you read some of the arguments that people put forth about why slavery wasn't really all that wrong and all these different things. You just look back at it and you're like, man, how can you not see it? Well, because they lived in a different day and a different culture where they had been informed by different thought processes. And it is very difficult for you and for me to not read today's way of thinking back into history. So if you were making up a story and setting it in, how many of you have ever read a historical fiction novel? Right? Most of them are so, unless they're like carefully researched to detail that most of them, they're good. I mean, they're fun, they're entertaining. That's the purpose of them. And they might expose you in some regards to that element of history or something like that. But most of them are filled with modern day ways of viewing things brought back into some previous time period. Filled with them. Because it's really hard not to, even if they're trying not to. Well, the Bible has none of that. Why? Because they claim that it was written in 500, 600, or later. But it's not there. Well, that would be one indicator of its authenticity. Independent, early attestation, meaning there are lots of early records that would say, all the way up to about 130, or back to 130 AD, that we could look and say there's manuscript evidence that goes all the way back to 130 AD that we know we can trace the manuscripts. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist before that. It's just we can trace them, knowing where they came from, all the way back to 130 AD, knowing that this is what it said, this is what the Bible said. I mean, that's really close. Really, really, really close. As a matter of fact, and I'm going to, just because I don't want to necessarily come back to all of this stuff again, but I want to pass this out to you because you guys can help me out. Maybe not you, but when you look at the manuscript evidence that is available, whether or not you could say, okay, well, I can trust this because there's all of these different things, and I'm going to rattle off the next. The embarrassment element within the Bible, the fact that the Bible characters are frequently portrayed as very imperfect people. If you were making up the story, if you were Peter and you were telling the story about yourself, I don't think you'd make yourself look as bad as Peter looks, as frequently as Peter looks that bad. I'm not sure that Moses, when he wrote about Abraham, probably would have made Abraham look as bad. Like the story, I mean, Moses obviously wrote the book of Genesis by God's direction. I don't know if he would have been like, they Abraham, Isaac, they both tried to sacrifice their wives for their own skin. Both of them did, right? Abraham did it down in Egypt, and Isaac did it with Abimelech, I think it's the other guy's name, and the other king's name. And so they both were like, well, I don't want to die for you. So that's a little embarrassing. I mean, we've all had embarrassing moments, but I've never said to my wife, I ain't going to die for you. You just tell me you're my sister. And some people even think we look like brother and sister, but I've never tried it. So Brother Hawk wasn't trying to kill us, and he just thought we were brother and sister. And so that was great. So, so embarrassing. Dissimilarity. Within the New Testament writing specifically, the Gospels, there is a lot of dissimilarities. If you were curating a story that you were going to try to pass off, you probably wouldn't make it so difficult. There's a lot of people that suppose there's contradictions within the Bible. Well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And those things are actually strengths to the authenticity of the Bible, because if literally, if you walk out that door tonight and somebody says, "Hey, what'd you guys talk about in there tonight?" and says it to every one of you, some of you would be like, "Oh." But even if you do have somewhat of an idea and you try to explain it, you will all explain it differently. Every single one of you. Right? Because that's the way we explain things. We all explain them differently. Well, the fact that the Bible has all throughout it multiple accounts of the same story, and they're all a little bit different. Those are indications of authenticity, and there's other evidence. I wanted to give this to you. So this one right here. So evidence of authenticity of the. So what I'm going to say this kind of out of order a little bit. So evidence for the authenticity of the New Testament is a ultimate proof for the historical Jesus, because if the stories of the manuscripts are true, then what they say about Jesus is true. He existed, he performed miracles, he died, he rose again from the grave. All of it's true. And there is, and so that's why I said the two are kind of go hand in hand. And then we have to ask this question, okay, then, how do we know that the Bible is true, right? Well, we can know it's true because it's affirmed by archaeology. One, there has never been one archaeological discovery, one, that has contradicted the Bible. That's crazy. Except it's true, so it's not crazy. But for people who suppose it's not true, let me explain that. There is massive manuscript evidence that the Bible that says this wasn't changed, hasn't been changed, is what it is, and goes all the way back, like I said a little while ago, all the way back to within just a little bit of time. And so just for your educational enjoyment, I thought I'd put this thing together for you. So how many of you have ever read Homer's Iliad? You know, the Iliad and the Odyssey? Have you ever read it? I'm the only one. Oh, very good. So how many of you ever read the Odyssey? Okay. Most people are more familiar with the Odyssey than the Iliad. But so Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer wrote it. So let me just go through this real quick. We're out of time anyway. So, but why manuscript evidence matters. Manuscript evidence helps us evaluate how faithfully an ancient text has been preserved. The quality of manuscripts, their age, and their agreement with one another all contribute to scholarly confidence. So Homer's Iliad is largely uncontested, right? If people just like, yeah, it is what it is, right? And no one doubts that a guy named Homer wrote this poem about all of these things, in the 800s BC, and all of that. No one seems to doubt that. But let's look at this side-by-side comparison chart for just a moment. All right, first of all, date of composition just said Homer's Iliad, the 8th century. New Testament, 45 to 95 AD. Total manuscripts that relate to Homer's Iliad, 1,800. Total manuscripts, 24,000 plus for the New Testament. Greek manuscripts of the Iliad, 650 to 700. And some of these numbers for the New Testament are actually a little higher than this, but they're for the New Testament, Greek manuscripts, 5,800. Other languages that you can find Homer's Iliad in, very, very few, if any. Other languages, early ancient languages for the Bible, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, others. Earliest fragments for the Iliad, 3rd century BC, AD 25 to AD 50 for the New Testament. The time gap from the original, when it was supposed to have been written, to when the first manuscript is available. For the Iliad, 500 years. For the Bible, 25 to 60 years. The genre of the Iliad is poetry. It's not even like claiming to be historically accurate. The genre for the Bible, historical narrative and letters, the New Testament specifically, scholarly confidence based on those things. People would look at the Iliad and say, yeah, we pretty much can be convinced that the Iliad is what Homer wrote. And that's how much evidence that. 1,800 manuscripts. The earliest one we have is 500 years later after it was supposed to have been written. And people are still just kind of like, yeah. And not just dismissively, but scholars are like, yeah, we're pretty well convinced. But the Bible has way more than that. We know that the authenticity of the biblical record, the manuscript evidence of it, it is what it is. You do not have to wonder. If somebody ever says, there is a lot of different people that wrote and changed this and that and the other thing, specifically talking about the New Testament, we'll some later date get into something about the Old Testament and how we know that Moses actually did write the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But the fact is that we know, because it is traced out for us in manuscript evidence that the Bible says what it said when it was written. And it was written, and we have records of its writing all the way back to very, very, very close to when Jesus was actually alive. So no, Jesus was not made up by the church. It was not made up by the disciples. Yes, the records go all the way back that far. And an accurate account of a true event is true. So then you have to dive in, and we didn't do that necessarily tonight, but you have to dive in. How do we know it's true? And all those kinds of things. But those are some things that I would have to say. So it took me a little longer to get through that. Thanks for not walking out on me. But are there any questions anybody wants to add, or comments, notations, anybody would like to chime in on all of that before we lay this under rest for a little while?
Just general observation that a lot of people don't even consider history. I mean, it's almost as if the world started when they were born, or like last year.
Yeah.
It seems to be a prevailing amongst non-Christians and subset of them as well. But I'm just reminded of George Orwell, who said that he who controls the present controls the past, who controls the past controls the future.
Yeah, and that's very true. So, and that's why it's important for us to have a well-grounded historical perspective on our faith, because we want to be the ones who actually can say, no, this is historically what Christians have believed and taught, and it was true then, and it is true now, and we'll dive into truth on all of that. So, any other thoughts on that? Are there any issues anybody would like to say, you should try to tackle this issue, or we should try to, I'm not doing it alone, we should try to tackle this issue, that you just want to chime out loud? I know you may not want to do that, so I'll give you a chance. You can tell me without it being in front of the group too. So, all right, good. Well, let's pray and we'll be done. Father, thank you for the day you gave us today. Thank you for the discussion tonight. I pray that it was advantageous to us. I pray that you'd help us to have a good rest of the night. Thank you for 2025. Lord, as we begin a new year, I pray that you would bless it, that you'd use it, you'd help us, and Lord, to use it in a way that would be pleasing and honoring to you. The great things would happen, Lord, through your word in our lives and the lives of others this year is our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thank